There's a little-known fact about anxiety problems, and that's that people with anxiety disorders are often more accurate at appraising risk than people without anxiety problems. Let me give you an example of how this works. A person with an anxiety disorder might be driving down the highway, and a thought might occur to them. I'm hurtling through space at 60 or 70 miles an hour in a tin can. This is an inherently risky position. One moment's inattention on my part, on the part of another driver, on the part of my mechanic, or even the highway crew, and I'm going to be killed or maimed. You know, this feels scary. I think I'll take the side roads. Now, a person without anxiety problems gets into a car and thinks, I'm in a well-engineered automobile. I'm certain that the designers and engineers at the manufacturing company, they were thinking about my safety at every juncture and not letting concerns about profit or loss or expense get involved in their decisions about design features. And that fellow over there in the next lane, screaming red-faced into his cell phone, he's paying attention. He's thinking about my welfare. My mechanic, I trust fully. And that sweet, pungent, smoky aroma that I get must be some kind of incense that he burns in the garage that helps him to pay better attention. Furthermore, I know from my own experience, as well as talking to others, that substance abuse is extremely rare in my culture, so it would be very unlikely that any other drivers might be impaired at this moment. I'm enjoying my drive. You see the problem here? The problem is that people with anxiety disorders actually notice that life is fragile and it's pretty dangerous to be alive, that at any moment, bad things can happen very readily to good people. This becomes an issue actually in psychotherapy, because often what happens is a psychotherapist will hear a person with anxiety talking about their difficulties, and the therapist, being well-meaning, will try to talk the person out of it. Will try to point out that, well, you shouldn't really worry about this. It's probably a low probability event, and you should be okay. The person with the anxiety disorder, if they have a good relationship with the therapist, they think, oh, my therapist is a nice man or lady. Obviously, he or she is in denial. I'll just kind of go along until we can change the topic and talk about something more interesting and useful to me. I actually find these findings to be very reassuring. Temperamentally, I happen to be a somewhat anxious person. So these findings don't do anything to allay my fears, but at least I can be right, and there is some satisfaction in that. So, given this, how can we possibly help people with anxiety problems? Well, we can start by examining the basic components of anxiety. And researchers and clinicians alike have identified 3 of these components. First, there's the physiological arousal, what happens in our body when adrenaline starts pumping around. We're going to discuss that in more detail in the next lecture when we talk about psychophysiological disorders specifically. Second, there's the cognitive and emotional part. There's all the future-oriented thinking and fear, and the accurate and inaccurate risk appraisal that we've just discussed. And finally, perhaps most importantly, there are the behavioral aspects. There are the avoidance and rituals, the things we do, in essence, in order to try to not feel anxious. Now, a fundamental challenge in working with anxiety is figuring out whether the anxiety is signal or noise. Because sometimes fear indicates genuine danger that needs our attention. If a patient came in and said, you know, doc, I get pretty anxious whenever I'm walking on a highway in dark clothes at night and there's no shoulder, well, naturally. But other times, the arousal doesn't actually require action. It's noise. It's just thinking another anxious thought that's not going to be particularly useful to respond to or take action to try to avert danger. And we need to be able to differentiate cognitively between the two. And this is tough because we have a negativity bias that we've discussed before. It's a propensity toward false positive errors. One of my favorite cartoons has 2 fish underwater, and one of them is definitely looking upset. And the upset fish says, you know, to tell you the truth, even when I'm in the water, I don't feel that comfortable. This is what we discover with mindfulness practice. we discover that there's almost always some baseline of anxiety happening in the body and in the mind. Sometimes it's little fears, and sometimes it's big ones. We also notice with mindfulness practice that we are forever toppling forward. We're thinking about the future, the future, the future. Looking forward to pleasure, trying to engineer things to have pleasant experiences, and dreading pain. Now, of course, there are some people who spend more time looking back, and those folks, I think in general, tend to experience depression more than anxiety. Those of us who are more anxious, we look forward quite a bit. Sometimes this can reach absurd degrees. For example, have you ever been out to eat with friends and gone to a nice restaurant where clearly the people in the kitchen have gone through a lot of trouble to prepare a lovely meal, well presented, and you're with your friends and you start eating the meal, and the topic of conversation before long starts to go to other places we might like to go eat. Oh yeah, there's that great new place that opened up across town. Wouldn't that be fun to try? So what happens is the mind leaves the experience of the present moment, leaves the taste of the food, and goes off into these fantasies about the future. It turns out that all anxiety is actually anticipatory. And even people that are in terrible present situations are worried about the future. Emergency medical technicians, EMTs, the folks on ambulances, they say that when they're extracting somebody from an accident, even if the person is bleeding and is in very bad shape, they're worried about the future. The person will think, will I be able to walk? Will my loved ones be okay? Will we survive? You can try this yourself. Think about something that makes you anxious. Just take a moment right now. We all don't have too much trouble usually coming up with something. You got it? Now, is the thing you're thinking about something about the past or the future? Take a moment. Usually, if it's something about the past, I'm actually not worried about what I did this morning. I'm worried that I'm going to be incarcerated tonight for what I did this morning. It really always is about the future. And then there's worry, which I have to think is a uniquely human capacity. I'm a good worrier. I happen to do a lot of traveling, giving presentations like this one. And in the Boston area, really the only practical way to get to the airport from where I live is to go through a tunnel that goes under Boston Harbor. So one day, I hadn't left really very much extra time, and I was driving into the tunnel, and halfway into the tunnel, I had an opportunity for taillight meditation because the traffic stopped. And then it stayed stopped. And it became one of those traffic jams where people get out of their cars to discuss the matter, and I started to worry. I started to think, what if I miss my flight? Well, there might be a later one, but there's a pretty busy travel day. There might not be any room in it. Could I drive or take the train? No, it's too far. Well, what can I do? Should I call the airline? No, that probably wouldn't help. Guess I'll just have to be here. I'll follow my breath. Rising, falling, rising, falling. What if I miss my flight? There might be a later one, but there's a pretty busy travel day. And the whole cycle just starts over and over and over. It's really quite remarkable the way this works. And usually what happens is when we get to the end of whatever the worry loop is, there's a feeling of like, oh gosh, what will I do? And then a sense of helplessness, and then we go on to start worrying again. Now, why do we do this? Now, sometimes, of course, we get positively reinforced. Sometimes we'll get into our worry loop and we'll come up with a novel solution to the problem. But most of the time, we don't. There's just something about going through the thinking process that gives us the illusion that it's somehow going to keep us safe and help us to cope and prepare us for what may come. Indeed, when I was sitting there in the tunnel, waiting and hoping, I wasn't just passively accepting my fate, I was actively worrying. We have a lot of techniques that we do to try to avoid the risk of fear or pain. This is because we find anxiety to be very unpleasant. One set of these we might call the Diver-Dan approach to life. And this involves phobic avoidance or constriction. It's the things that we do in order to avoid any circumstance that might bring on fear or might bring on discomfort. You know folks like this. If they're going to the airport, they head there 3 hours early. In fact, often they don't even go to the airport. They decide, I'd rather not travel. I'd rather stay home. Traveling makes me nervous. And then there are the things we do directly to tackle anxiety when it comes up. An awful lot of people medicate anxiety. Now, sometimes that's with prescription drugs that are prescribed by a doctor. Very often it's not. Very often it's simply having a drink under this circumstance or that, or using other drugs. Probably what we do more than anything else is we try to distract ourselves. You want to guess what the leading leisure activity is in America? What do we do more of here than anything else in our free time? If you guessed watch television, you got that right. Then think about what number 2 might be. A lot of times these days people will say the internet, but that's actually a subset of what number 2 is. Number 2 is shopping. It's looking to acquire new things. I remember in the early days of the internet when it was just shifting over from being the province of the military and the province of academic institutions into becoming the World Wide Web where it would be accessible to everybody. I heard Bill Gates being interviewed. And he was saying, when the internet really takes hold, it's going to be fantastic. It is going to be a worldwide marketplace. And I thought, well, a library, I could get that. A post office, I could get that. But a marketplace? Now we know why he's Bill Gates and I'm Ron. It's become a marketplace. And we spend an inordinate amount of time shopping on the internet. Now, the problem with all of these different forms of distraction is we develop what's called stimulation tolerance. We wind up needing more and more or higher and higher doses in order to distract ourselves from unpleasant thoughts or feelings, including anxiety. Some of you may remember Perry Mason. If you don't, if you're too young to remember him, Perry Mason was the precursor to Law and Order. It was a very early cop and lawyer show. And on Perry Mason, there used to almost always be a scene. It would look like this. You'd see somebody with their hand outstretched, having a pistol in the hand, and boom, you'd see the gun go off, and then there would be a body lying down. I don't even think there was blood shown. It was just somebody lying down. And this was the intense moment of the show. This is all happening on a 14-inch black and white set, but it would rivet the whole country watching this and distract us effectively from our own personal concerns. Nowadays, if you're watching Law and Order, Hideous Event 7, or whatever they're up to, there's never just one story. Because if there were just one story, we might habituate to it. We might start again thinking about our thoughts and feelings and our fears. So instead, there's always at least 2 stories. And in one of them, there's a doe-eyed child being ritually dismembered by some kind of satanic cult. In another, there's some kind of very attractive vixen or something involved in some weird sexual activity. And we can be watching all of this on a 50 to 60-inch flat screen, full color TV and think, there's nothing too interesting on. I think I'll change the channel. So the problem is that when we try to use distraction, we need more and more of it to bring ourselves away from our fears. Now, how do anxiety disorders actually develop? Most of them develop through what's called escape avoidance learning. So here's how you can create an anxiety disorder in just a few simple steps. First, you have to enter a situation. Let's call it the supermarket, for example. And let's say that you're walking down the cereal aisle. Now, the strict biological determinists or some behaviorists will say anxiety tends to arise at random. Other mental health professionals say, I don't really think it's so random, but I think the process is often unconscious. So let's say I'm walking down the cereal aisle. And let's say something happened when I was 5 or 6 years old with my brother at the kitchen table involving Cocoa Puffs. It's long since been repressed because it was a painful experience as a young child. But here I am walking down the cereal aisle, and unconsciously, I just happened to spy out of my peripheral vision the Cocoa Puffs. And that's enough to bring up a little bit of anxiety, because this is how associational memory works. It just takes a little trigger to be able to connect us back to something that's been difficult. So anxiety is going to arise. Now, we find anxiety unpleasant. So most of us try to take steps to get rid of it. especially if we have some kind of misattribution. If I start to think, uh-oh, maybe I'm having a cardiac problem, or uh-oh, I'm getting short of breath, I may have trouble breathing, or uh-oh, I'm going to have some kind of real anxiety episode, I'm going to want to flee the situation. And chances are I'll leave the cereal aisle. In fact, I may even leave the supermarket entirely and go out into the parking lot. Once I get into the parking lot, that's going to feel better. The anxiety is going to abate. And this reduction in anxiety is called negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is a principle in learning theory about the reinforcement that comes from removing an unpleasant experience. Like if I'm being hit over the head with a hammer and I do a certain behavior and I stop being hit over the head with a hammer, I'm going to be more likely to do that behavior the next time because it feels good to have the negative experience stop. So once this is negatively reinforced, what do you think is going to happen the next time that I enter the supermarket? Even if I don't go near the cereal aisle, I'm going to have a thought that goes something like, gosh, I hope I don't feel the way I did the last time I was here. And that's going to be enough to get a little bit of anxiety going in my mind and body. And once a little bit of anxiety starts going, I'm going to have another thought. I'm going to have the thought, uh-oh, it's happening again. And chances are I'm going to get into the same loop, leave again, more negative reinforcement for fleeing, and after a while I might start avoiding the supermarket entirely. And then this can extend to other things, and I can start avoiding the post office and other locations. This can work its way into full-blown what's called agoraphobia, which is fear of the marketplace, fear of going out into the world. But even if it doesn't get to that state, most of us develop these patterns in little ways around things that we're afraid of and we start to avoid. So how might we treat this? What would the answer be? Well, the general answer in modern psychology is exposure and response prevention. Let me give you an example of how this works. You know, it's been said that by the mid-1980s, there were no upper-class men or women left at North American universities with untreated snake phobias. And this is because they had all been recruited for studies in the psychology department. And this is what the studies look like. They would invite the student to come into the lab, and they would sit them in an office and just talk to them. And they would tell the student that there's a snake locked in a cage down the hall. Now, in the early days, they used to think that it was necessary to do something called reciprocal inhibition. In other words, to train the student to do something so that they should feel less anxious. So when the student starts going, uh-oh, what kind of snake? They would start teaching them relaxation training and things like that. They've since learned that it's not actually necessary to teach the student relaxation training. All you have to do is stay with the experience long enough until the anxiety abates by itself. So what you do is you talk to the student, describe the snake, answer their questions, and wait it out. Wait until nothing happens and eventually the anxiety starts to abate. Then what you do is you move the snake a little bit closer. And you tell the student, well, now it's in the next office. They get anxious again, you wait for it to calm down. The essential thing is to actually get to the point where you can bring the snake into the office. So here you have the scene of the snake in the cage and the student sitting in front of it. The next step, which of course is the hardest, is you have to remove the lid of the cage, take out the snake, and have the student actually handle the snake. And if, as a researcher, you've had sufficient foresight as to choose a non-venomous species, if you do this a number of times, the student loses their snake phobia. Basically, the fear response becomes extinguished because they experience that nothing terrible happens. Now, when people are coming into therapy for anxiety problems, they're not actually interested in handling the snake, by and large, or whatever the equivalent might be. People want us to eliminate the anxious feeling. Instead, what we're going to do in a mindfulness-oriented approach is to increase their capacity to bear it, to change their relationship to the experience. Very much the way we were discussing when we discussed depression earlier. Now, this is not a new idea. Here's what the Buddha said about it 2,500 years ago. He said, "Why do I dwell always expecting fear and dread? What if I subdue that fear and dread, keeping the same posture that I'm in when it comes upon me? While I walked, the fear and dread came upon me. I neither stood, nor sat, nor lay down until I had subdued that fear and dread." Now, you may recall that the meditation practices we've been doing are practiced typically in 4 different postures: sitting, standing, walking, and lying down. So what the Buddha is saying here is, whatever I'm doing, I don't scratch the itch, I don't adjust to make the pain go away, same thing we've been talking about in meditation instructions throughout the course, but rather I simply stay with the experience until it transforms by itself. So basically, what we're trying to do is learn how to face our fears. There's another wonderful cartoon that shows a phone booth with a fellow in it. And the phone booth is being suspended by a cable, held out by something like a fishing rod from a high window in an apartment building or an office. And the guy in the phone booth is like going nuts and trying to get out. And the caption is Professor Gallagher and his controversial technique of simultaneously confronting the fear of snakes, heights, and the dark. I neglected to mention there's a snake inside as well. So, and fear of enclosed places also, even though it's not in the caption. So this idea that facing the fears is what can free us turns out to be true both in classical behavioral treatment and it's true in a mindfulness-oriented treatment. And what we can do is we can try together a stepping into fear exercise where we practice doing this. It's a variation on Professor Gallagher's famous study, only we don't need the high window and we don't need the phone booth to do it. So let's try that together. So this is stepping into fear, a variation on Professor Gallagher's famous experiment. Begin by finding a comfortable and alert posture. And for this too, allow your eyes to close and find your breath to bring your attention into the present moment. And now see if you can sense any tension or anxiety anywhere in your body. Maybe just a little bit here or there. And once you sense that, see if you can ramp it up a bit. Because what we want to do is increase our capacity to be with anxiety. And to do that, we have to intensify it enough to be able to really feel it. So try to ramp it up a bit to a level where you can really feel it. You may be able to do this by simply bringing your attention to the sensations of anxiety in the body, or perhaps you'll need to conjure up an image or a thought that you know can pretty reliably get you going. So once you feel the anxiety, see if you can bring it up to a level where it feels a little bit challenging, not overwhelming, but yeah, this is a bit uncomfortable. And once you get it up to that level, try to keep it there for a bit. Now it's important to keep breathing as you do this, and keep your alert and dignified posture. So just breathe with the fear. Breathe with the anxiety, and just accept it as another set of body sensations. Just feeling exactly how it feels in the heart, in the muscles. Ah, my old friend fear. My old friend anxiety. I know you. And we're just going to stay with it for a little while, increasing our capacity to bear it. Should other thoughts come up that distract you from your anxiety, come back to the sensations of the anxiety. Let them be the object of your awareness. And if the anxiety starts to fade, do whatever you need to do to ramp it back up. Perhaps you'll need to come up with new images. Perhaps you'll need to focus with greater intensity on the sensations in the body. Just keep breathing and keep being with the anxiety. Don't let it get away from you. Otherwise, you won't have the opportunity to practice. Just be with your old pal. You know, you evolved the capacity for anxiety millions and millions of years ago. It's protected us through so many difficulties. Let's just appreciate it, honor it, and feel it. And do whatever you need to make sure that it doesn't slip away, to be able to keep feeling it in the body. You may not be accustomed to embracing anxiety or fear in this way. It kind of changes the experience a bit. But we learn that it's a sensation that we can invite into our life, to simply allow to be there. So just for another few moments, feel it. And then you can come back to your breath and allow the anxiety to seek its own level. You don't have to keep it up anymore, but nor do you have to chase it away. You can just allow it to be there. Now in this exercise, we're doing this for a short period, but to really practice being with anxiety, it helps to do it for a longer period, and that's why we have included in your recordings the stepping into fear exercise as a longer practice. Well, I hope you found that exercise interesting. And the exercise is actually much more powerful if you extend it out during a longer period of time. And that's why we've included an audio recording of the exercise in the course materials. Even though I know it seems strange, like, why would I want to make myself anxious like this? I think you'll find that if you try that exercise over a longer period of time, that it can actually be quite powerful and that it can actually help to change your relationship to anxious feelings. Now, many of our anxieties are actually about what we might think of as narcissistic threats. They're threats to us or our loved ones or who we think we are. A lot of our anxieties are things like threats to our self-image. I'll look badly. What will people think of me? And the like. Sometimes it's about our health. What if I get this disease or that disease? A lot of anxieties have to do with wealth. What if I don't have enough money? What if I have less money than somebody else? Broadly, it's about anticipating that we might lose pleasure or experience pain. Another great cartoon has a couple of middle-aged women sitting around and a rather hapless middle-aged man sitting there in the middle. And the caption is, "Donald is such a fatalist. He's convinced he's going to grow old and die." We have some existential problems that we have to face. The reality of old age, of illness, of death can produce a lot of anxiety for ourselves. And mindfulness practices can, of course, help us with this. In part, the focus on the present moment is antithetical to the anticipatory anxiety. If my attention is here, then I'm not so focused on what's happening later. We can really take an attitude of not knowing. We can take refuge in the present moment. Very often when we're having anxious thoughts about what's going to happen in the future, it's because we can't stand the uncertainty. We have a lot of difficulty tolerating the fact that we really don't know what's going to happen in the next moment. And yet, we really don't know what's going to happen in the next moment. There's a wonderful story about a meditation teacher in a Thai monastery, and he had some Western monks there, and one of the Western monks comes and says, to the teacher, "I just want to let you know I won't be around the monastery tomorrow because tomorrow I have to go into Bangkok. I'm going to be there taking care of some financial matters." And the teacher says, "Maybe." It's very hard for us to live not knowing. And yet, mindfulness practice can help us to do that more by bringing us back to the present moment. There's also a safety that comes from identifying with a universe larger than us so that I don't have to be so worried about these various narcissistic threats. Something else that scares us a lot are unwanted feelings. Much anxiety is fear of our own emotions and impulses, fear of the tigers within. I might be afraid of my anger, or my sadness, or sexual urges that wouldn't be accepted by others or that I'd be judged for. I might be afraid of repressed or suppressed memories, or unacceptable thoughts of all sorts. When these things start to arise, we find ourselves getting anxious. And doing mindfulness practice regularly allows opportunities for these feelings and impulses to arise and be accepted, to become integrated, so that we no longer fear and resist them. And then the source of anxiety abates. This is one reason why I've been encouraging you throughout the course, and encourage you now again, to please try these practices in between the lectures. Because the more time we spend sitting with our experience, the more we can integrate these different contents of the mind, and the less we have to be afraid of them. Now, if you're particularly anxious, it can be hard to just sit and do something like the breath meditation. So in those situations, it's usually best to do a more active practice, to do something like walking meditation, or eating meditation, or even hatha yoga, which is a form of very gentle stretching that can be done in a mindful way. All of these things are easier. The same way you see when somebody's waiting outside of a surgical room, for example, at the hospital, they tend to pace. It dissipates the anxiety a little bit, makes it easy to work with. So in our next lecture, we're going to look at a set of remarkably common difficulties that are closely related to anxiety and that have actually become an epidemic in modern societies, where mindfulness practices are particularly well suited to help. And these are stress-related medical disorders. As you'll see, these conditions include a number of maladies that we don't always think of as being stress-related. Thanks for listening.